Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the 2022 ICRRA conference, Culture in Security, International Cultural Relations as an Enabler of Peace through Engagement. We are delighted to have you with us for this session, which is the second of 5 online sessions through which we are exploring the contribution of arts, culture, education, and civil society to peace and security, and thinking in particular about the role that international cultural relations programs can play in that. We are also delighted that our conference was selected to be an official side event to the UNESCO Mondial Cult 2022 World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, which gets underway in Mexico City later this week. I am Cesar Villanueva, Professor of Culture and International Relations at Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, and also a member of the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative, NACDI. I'll be sharing this session today. Before I introduce our speaker, Professor Karima Bennoune, I just wanted to say a few words to frame how the session fits into the overall program on the conference and its wider aims and objectives, and to highlight also some of the key themes that we might be able to pick up in the discussion later on. Before I do that, just a bit more background and context for you. For those who are not familiar with ICRRA, it stands for the International Cultural Relations Alliance. We are a network of academics and practitioners from around the world, convened by IFA, the Institut for Auslandsbeziehungen, Institute for Foreign Relations of Germany, and the British Council. We're drawn together by a common interest in sharing knowledge from research and practice in international cultural relations. That is, knowledge about the various engagements and interactions that occur between countries, communities, cultures, and peoples across the fields of culture, education, arts, civil society, heritage, and so on, outside of our formal diplomatic channels or official state structures. We're also committed to making our network truly global, one that is inclusive and representative of the expertise and perspectives from around the world, including Global South. Hopefully, that is something you see reflected in the program for this magnificent conference. On our website, you can find more information and videos from our past conferences as well. So what we are aiming to do in this year's conference, is to create a better understanding of how and why culture, broadly understood, needs to be at the heart of global efforts to build more peaceful, secure, and inclusive societies, a key requirement for sustainable development. We're focusing in particular here on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and more specifically on the SDGs. We are promoting and arguing for, in effect, a more holistic understanding of peace and security, one that acknowledges and embraces the role of culture in providing spaces for encounters, learning, social cohesion, as well as inclusive relationships building. Exactly the kind of social practices that are at the heart of sustainable peaceful group formations. And we will also ask in particular how and why international cooperation in this field can be supportive for these objectives. So this conference is about culture, and it's also about international cultural relations. That is, programs, projects, initiatives, and encounters that bring people of different backgrounds, countries, and communities together through and around culture. We want to understand how these relationships work in practice in different cultural and political contexts worldwide. And we are asking where and how this has the potential to foster that more holistic approach to peace and security that we think is needed around the world. With Mondia Cult in mind, we hope to draw all of this to provide actionable recommendations for UNESCO and its stakeholders that can help to re-energize delivery of the SDGs over the coming years until the end of the decade, the target of the date of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So that's the overarching scope of the conference. We've given ourselves an ambitious task, but we are glad to have you on board this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. On today's session, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Karima Bennoune. Karima Bennoune is the incoming Louis M. Symes Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. This is effective from January 2023 in the United States, and currently a visiting professor at the school. She specializes in international law and human rights. Bennoune served as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. During her tenure as Special Rapporteur, she authored inter alia innovative reports on human rights, approach to cultural heritage, on climate change and cultural rights, and on cultural mixing. She also was appointed as an expert for the International Criminal Court in 2017 during the preparation phases of the groundbreaking case, the prosecutor versus Ahmad al-Faqih al-Mahdi, concerning international destruction of cultural heritage sites in Mali. A former legal advisor for Amnesty International, she has carried out human rights missions in most regions of the world. She sits on the Scholar Advisory Board of Muslim for Progressive Values. Her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, received the 2014 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for nonfiction. The book addresses the work of many people of Muslim heritage against extremism. The related TED Talk, When People of Muslim Heritage Challenge Fundamentalism, has received more than 1.5 million views. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, Professor Bennoune, to have you with us. Just before I continue and leave you the floor, I want to explain quickly the format of the session. We have basically 45 minutes to talk about the main topic that has us here. And in today's sessions, we assume that cultural rights are at the heart of the contemporary debates, and the human dimension of security makes it possible to bring cultural policies back in as a territory of contestation. In today's session, our keynote speaker, Professor Bennoune, suggests that humanity is facing a global cross-regional political crisis marked by increasing polarization, a turn to extremes, questioning of equality, dignity, universality, and diversity by some, leading a closing of minds and borders and a normalization of hatred. I encourage the audience to post questions in the chat as the conference goes along. I also remind you, all of these sessions are being recorded, including this one, and those recordings will be made available on the IFA website and YouTube channels afterwards. Having explained all of this in detail, Professor Bennoune, I leave you the floor. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm going to very quickly put up my PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to see that in just a moment. Professor Villanueva, are you able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, it looks very, very fine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really would like to thank the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance for inviting me to participate in this important event where we focus on culture in security, international cultural relations as an enabler of peace through engagement. And I send in particular warm greetings to all of those who will be participating in Mondiacult. And this is a wonderful reminder of the many global convenings I was able to take part in while I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights. And I have to say I've missed them very much in the pandemic, but I am grateful that we have these opportunities still to come together in cyberspace as our opportunities to be together in person are beginning to take place again. And I think it's especially meaningful to come together through culture as we do because we live in such a deeply divided and fractured world. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres reminded us of this in very stark words last week at the beginning of the 77th UN General Assembly meeting. He said, "Our world is blighted by war, battered by climate chaos, scarred by hate, and shamed by poverty, hunger, and inequality." And it seems to me that those words are really the backdrop for our discussions in this important convening. It is, as he reminded us, a critical moment to draw from culture and to find creative ways to do so, so as to urgently find the solutions that we need in this early 21st century fraught with all of these challenges. So I think our conversation here is very timely indeed. In my time, what I would like to do is to provide an overview of cultural rights. Some of you may be experts in this subject. Some of you may be newer, perhaps, to cultural rights perspectives. Then I would like to contemplate some of the intersections of culture and human rights and what they mean for this broader discussion. And then finally, to begin to reimagine international cultural relations a bit through this cultural rights lens. So that's how I'm hoping to proceed. International cultural relations involves adding the cultural dimension to international relations. So we transform IR into ICR. And this has become an increasingly popular and prominent field since the 1980s in particular. Now, classical approaches to this subject, when you survey the literature, seemed to primarily recognize culture as a site of power and to try to deploy that power, in particular for the purposes of specific states. The idea, to paraphrase Francois Chauvet, was that the cultural piece somehow disguised the politics. Today, we often hear people refer to cultural initiatives of this kind as examples of the exercise of soft power. Such projects have become complicated in what Tim Winter described as an increasingly complicated space as competing geocultural imaginaries have been enacted. These were also sometimes the sort of traditional cultural diplomacy paradigms. These were ways of thinking that were not necessarily committed to global equalities or human rights, and in fact, sometimes operated consciously through exploiting some of the global inequalities and cultural inequalities in particular, and perhaps being silent about what were seen as inconvenient aspects of human rights. But we've seen a sort of a wonderful transition as many in the field have reimagined traditional cultural diplomacy as international cultural relations, emphasizing its transnational dimensions and the bridge building functions of cultures, and factoring in carefully and thoughtfully values such as accessibility and equity. Today, I think we can take this transformation a step further by infusing international cultural relations approaches with insights from the field of human rights, including cultural rights, and by doing so consistently. This work is underway in many quarters. though I would say that the reflection of cultural rights in the related debates and in international cultural spaces, including, frankly, UNESCO, is inconsistent. And I think that's something that we need to consider. So as we examine the crossroads of culture and politics in this meeting, it is exciting actually to me to pause and also see how seriously cultural interactions and analyses are now being taken in increasing numbers of fields, including fields related to the study of conflicts and peace. While much of the work in international cultural relations has been in the social sciences and in the humanities, I am glad to see growing interest in these same intersections in my own field of international law, and that's what I pause to reference here. And I would mention two examples, and there are many others. I would mention, for example, the unprecedented March 2020 symposium organized by the American Journal of International Law's electronic edition. That's an edition known as AGIL Unbound. And this symposium was entitled Art, Aesthetics, and International Law. And at least in the US context, international lawyers had really not thought along these lines before, had not contemplated arts and culture and the interaction with their discipline as a relevant topic of study. For a second, more recent example, even more prominent, I would note that at this year's annual meeting of the American Society of International Law, a newly elected judge of the International Court of Justice, so one of the highest courts in international law, and this judge is named Hilary Charlesworth from Australia. She actually presented the annual Distinguished Grotius Lecture at the conference, which is the highlight of the conference, about what she called the art of international law. And I think this was surprising to some international lawyers. But this World Court judge argued that, quote, as international law influences some aspects of art, art can reflect, influence, or even shape events in international law and sustain or undermine the law's legitimacy and authority. It was an unprecedented speech in the history of the society, and I hope it suggests that there will be many more conversations of this kind in the field of international law, because I think it highlighted, if I might for a moment paraphrase the words of the scholar Shoshana Fellman, it highlighted that sometimes precisely what needs to be heard in the field of international law or in the field of international relations cannot be articulated in legal language alone. And here I think cultures can play a truly critical role. As a commentator on Judge Charlesworth's speech, my job then was to suggest the importance of introducing specifically a cultural rights element to this process of integrating international law and culture. Art, culture, and international law are becoming increasingly acquainted, but rights need to be a part of that equation. And this is the subject for my remarks today as well. And so before I proceed further, I will offer a brief overview of cultural rights, which is perhaps a less well-known branch of the international human rights framework in many circles, although I suspect that many in this august audience who are cultural experts have a great deal of familiarity with this topic. Nonetheless, it is a framework that sometimes is left out of discussions in the cultural field, including discussions of international cultural relations. So I wanted to pause for a moment and really emphasize its importance as a critical frame for our discussions here. And I, of course, approach this from the beginning very much as a professor of international law by turning to some of the key legal texts that we have, and you see some of those on the screen. So cultural rights are codified in a number of international instruments, among the most important of which include Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration will soon celebrate its 75th anniversary next year, so we have seen the codification of cultural rights for quite some time now, as well as Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so a treaty which is binding on 171 state parties in every region of the world. And the cultural rights that these instruments guarantee include the right of everyone to take part in cultural life without discrimination. And that non-discrimination commitment is something that I emphasize throughout my time as Special Rapporteur. These cultural rights guaranteed in international law also include the right to access and enjoy cultural heritage, which is part of the right to take part in cultural life, as well as the rights to artistic and scientific freedom, amongst others. And artistic freedom is so important that it is actually one of the few human rights that you can find guaranteed in both of the covenants. So on economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as on civil and political rights. And I think it is just so critically important to remember that there are legal rights and legal commitments of states at issue in the discussions that we are having here. And I want to, in particular, note Article 15, paragraph 4 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which I think is so relevant for our discussions. And as I said in my report on COVID-19 and cultural rights, does not get as much attention as it deserves. I really emphasized in my work that this dimension of international cooperation, which Article 15, paragraph 4 highlights, is utterly essential to the implementation of cultural rights for all, as well as other human rights. And it is an article which tacitly recognizes the important role of international cultural relations in guaranteeing human rights. Here you see states come together to recognize the benefits to be derived from international cooperation in, amongst others, the cultural field. So I think this is a value recognized in international law, recognized by states around the world, that we have to highlight again and again. Other critical methodological commitments of the cultural rights framework include consultation, participation, as well as non-discrimination, which I already mentioned. And I think it can really reshape our understanding of international cultural relations if we constantly recall that states have international legal commitments in the field of culture, including the obligation to guarantee cultural rights for all without discrimination, and including this recognition of the key role in international cooperation in achieving that goal. These commitments should inform and indeed circumscribe the means and the goals of international cultural relations. This can enhance their potential as engines of what this event's title labels peace through engagement. Though cultural rights may be less well known as rights concepts than other aspects of human rights, at least perhaps outside some of our circles that are very focused on these issues, cultural rights are core to the human experience. They have inherent importance for human dignity, and they are essential for implementing other universal human rights. And I think in this audience, perhaps I do not have to work very hard to convince my colleagues because they already agree with many of these views. But in the UN system, I saw one of my key jobs as making these points again and again, because cultural rights, unfortunately, were sometimes overlooked or were seen as sort of a luxury item, especially in the face of international crises such as the pandemic. So in my work as Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights from 2015 to 2021, I tried to demonstrate again and again that cultural rights are actually a crucial part of responses to many current challenges that we face. Everything from discrimination to the climate emergency, to COVID-19, to conflicts, and that cultural rights also had to be understood as essential rights for facilitating and realizing sustainable development. And I've repeated again and again in my reports that the Sustainable Development Goals are key to the implementation of cultural rights and vice versa. And I'm sorry that there isn't a specific goal on culture, although culture features in many other goals. And safeguarding and promoting culture in all its diversities contributes directly to the achievement of these many sustainable development goals. Now, special rapporteurs on cultural rights, there are now have been 3 of us. I was succeeded by my distinguished colleague, Alexandra Zantaki of Greece. I was preceded by my distinguished colleague, Farida Shahid of Pakistan. And all 3 of us have emphasized that cultural rights protect, in particular, human creativity in all its diversity, as well as the conditions for that creativity to be exercised, developed, and made accessible. And I think that's where we go beyond, significantly go beyond a traditional freedom of expression approach by also looking at sort of the conditions that facilitate the exercise of human creativity. That's the sort of first set of things that we've emphasized. We've also emphasized that cultural rights protect, in particular, the rights both of individuals and of groups of human beings to participate or not to participate in a cultural life of their choice and to conduct their own cultural practices, and the right to interact and exchange regardless of group affiliation and of frontiers. And I think all 3 of these aspects, and there are a number of others, but I won't list them all 3 of these aspects that we highlighted are critically important to consider in our discussions, but perhaps that last piece about interaction and exchanges and the importance of these interactions and exchanges, including at the international level, as being key guarantors of international human rights are very important to remember here. So during my time as Special Rapporteur, I tried to remind governments and indeed the UN system itself just how important these rights and these priorities that I just mentioned are. And I did this by stressing that humanity restores and reimagines itself through creating and revising its cultural life, and that cultural and artistic expressions are important in and of themselves, but also have a strong transformative power and can influence the societies we live in. And of course, as we have seen, this power can be used either to maintain division in our world and in our societies or to overcome it. Some artistic and cultural practices have been at the front line of resisting oppression and upholding the values of human rights and inclusion. And I think these will be increasingly important in days to come as we're seeing, again, the rise of authoritarianism in various places in the world. Some artistic and cultural practices have really focused on creating spaces for learning, reflecting, experimenting, and embracing complexity. They can offer experiences of non-coercive and constructive meaning-making and empowerment that contribute to reaching a wide range of human rights goals and to peace itself. And I see peace and human rights together in a very holistic way, not one pitted against the other, as we've seen too often in some dominant discourses. Artistic and cultural initiatives can provide tools to understand suffering and means of expression for individuals, groups, and entire societies, and can help in these ways to increase the capacity to recover from human rights violations and to recover from conflict. They can uphold the values of diversity, human rights, and inclusion, and strengthen those standing against extremist ideologies or seeking to reclaim public space after violent acts. Artistic and cultural initiatives that underscore what unites different people despite their diversity can make a particularly important contribution, including to the achievement of peace and a just peace in particular. And I think of an example that I gave in my report to the Human Rights Council on socially engaged artistic initiatives back in 2018, when I recounted that in Burundi, drumming groups in which all ethnic groups in the country were represented had existed before the ethnic violence of the 1990s erupted in that country. And the participants in these drumming groups had really built their groups around the shared musical practice, where they experienced values of interethnic trust and solidarity, and chose to emphasize their identities as drummers over their ethnic origin. And the very moving outcome of this was that between March of 1994 and 1998, these drummers, during the ethnic violence, continued playing and performing together in different neighborhoods. They supported each other, and they even saved each other's lives repeatedly because they had built a particular sense of shared identity around cultural practice. And this to me is, I think, a very positive example and something which needs to be replicated and supported in other contexts where peace building and the protection of human rights in the face of conflict is so critical today. So active engagement in the cultural sphere offers crucial possibilities to contribute to social debates, to challenge assumptions about accepted beliefs, to revisit culturally inherited ideas and concepts, and to reshape meanings. And I think all of these avenues can contribute to finding peaceful solutions. Cultural initiatives can help develop individual and collective capacities that are central traits of democratic citizenship, such as critical thinking, creativity, acceptance of differences, commitment to the universality of human rights, and to equality. And we have never needed to strengthen all of those aspects of our societies so much as we do today. Investments in the field of culture and in the conditions that allow people to fully participate in cultural life are absolutely necessary to create cultural democracies and to foster civic engagement, including engagement for peace. And another message that I often carried to governments was that all of this makes proposed budget cuts in the cultural areas, as we've seen in recent years, deeply worrying indeed. It affects the cultural sectors, but it also affects all of these contributions which the enjoyment of cultural rights can make to our societies overall. Creative approaches in the field of culture contribute in many ways to trying to build and maintain the peaceful societies we need in which all human rights can find increased realization. And this means that governments have the responsibility to preserve existing cultural spaces and institutions for the exercise of cultural rights, but also to create new ones rather than cutting back on them, and to support voices of tolerance, equality, and diversity in these contexts. Of course, there also can be many negative aspects and usages of cultures in regard to law and human rights. And this was a message I had to be clear about. There are choices that are made here. These are fields which are used in a range of ways. Arts and images can also be used to celebrate histories of human rights violations and impunity for those violations, or to promote problematic narratives about current or past conflicts, or to incite discrimination and violence. And we've even seen certain forms of artistic expression actually being used very consciously by extremists and diverse extremists in this day and age to promote their messages. And in fact, I think this is all the more reason to take the intersections of law, rights, and culture seriously. And thinking of these sort of negative aspects, I regularly recalled in the UN what cultural rights are not. And I saw that as a core part of my mission when I was Special Rapporteur. Cultural rights are not the same thing as cultural relativism. Cultural rights do not justify discrimination or violence. They are firmly embedded in the universal human rights framework. And indeed, the UN Human Rights Council itself, so the highest political body in the field of human rights in the UN system, has regularly repeated that cultural rights are an integral part of human rights, which are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. And I think very important to have that holistic vision. Now, in recent years, in part due to the efforts of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, but also very much due to cultural actors, governments, civil society around the world taking these issues forward and pushing very hard, we have seen that cultural rights have gained in legitimacy at the international level. And this is a very positive development. But I would say that much remains to be done to fulfill the Human Rights Council's vision, that is, of cultural rights as a fully co-equal branch of international human rights and recognized as such. And unfortunately, we're seeing that the cultural dimension of human rights is too often overlooked, and that's still the case. So we're seeing tremendous progress, but also, there are some worrying signs that the mainstreaming of cultural rights is far from being really fully achieved. And I think here, for example, of the work of Pablo de Graef, my former colleague, who was the former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, and reparation. And he has specifically argued that transitional justice has generally and systematically ignored claims of culture. And he has insisted on the importance of recognizing the unparalleled potential of cultural interventions and the critical roles they can and should play in transitional justice processes. Unfortunately, there remain numerous obstacles to overcome in achieving such recognition of the potential of cultural initiatives across the field of international law broadly, and I think we can talk about some of those challenges in the discussion if people are interested in how we might tackle them. But I do want to overall stress the very positive sense that all of the work that all of you have been doing, that so many sectors committed to cultural rights have been doing, has made a significant difference. And I gave many examples of this in my report for the 10th anniversary of the Cultural Rights Mandate back in 2019. I will put the link to the mandate website where you can find that and all the other reports that I've mentioned in the chat when I am done with my remarks. And I was really struck at the progress that has been made when cultural rights got a very high level recognition in the UN system that it hadn't had before. And this was in 2019 in his speech to the Human Rights Council, when the UN Secretary General, in a different speech than the very pessimistic one I quoted at the beginning of my remarks, in a much more optimistic speech, when he specifically emphasized that what he said was, quote, "More people are speaking out about the indispensability of cultural rights for protecting the diversity of beliefs and practices on our planet, recognizing these rights as an essential tool for preserving diversity and our common heritage," unquote. And this to me was such an important recognition, with the Secretary General making this statement specifically referencing cultural rights, which to my knowledge he hadn't done before in a high level body like the UN Human Rights Council. Another thing which I thought was very interesting is that implicit in the Secretary General's comment was that cultural rights do not implement themselves. And he was focusing on those around the world, those advocates for cultural rights, and the importance of their work. Many actors must be engaged in and committed to the process of implementing cultural rights. Certainly, governments must adopt cultural rights-based cultural policies and realize them. But the work of those I call cultural rights defenders, and I'll explain that a bit more in the moment, sometimes within government, but also within civil society, is absolutely critical in this regard. Both cultural rights and those who defend them and they defend them sometimes at considerable risk to themselves, both cultural rights and those who defend them should be taken into consideration in the design of all initiatives in the field of international cultural relations. And so this now brings me back to thinking about what insights from the field of cultural rights can be usefully incorporated into international cultural relations approaches, and can be and should be. And some of this is already happening if you see some of the reports that have come out recently in this field. And I wanted to say how much potential I see for working in both international cultural spaces and intercultural spaces in terms of promoting peace, and how often I saw this at work in my time as UN Special Rapporteur. And I think this potential is really amplified when human rights values are respected in the design of such spaces. It is vitally important to understand human rights as a parameter for international cultural relations. The goals must be respectful of human rights. These kinds of initiatives must not paper over real challenges in the field or seek to disappear them when they're inconvenient. These rights, human rights, cultural rights, must not be sacrificed in the name of harmony and understanding, and the rights of the cultural practitioners involved need to be respected. Now, one of the most powerful examples I encountered while I was Special Rapporteur was the example of the Bi-Communal Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage in Cyprus. And I saw there is someone from Cyprus, I think, on this Zoom. So my greetings. And this technical committee, which our colleague from Cyprus, I'm sure, is very well aware of, but some of us may not have encountered, brings together Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots and Cypriots of different backgrounds from all parts of the island to reconstruct and repair the cultural heritage of all, and to do so together. And their approach is very specifically universal. That is, they are concerned with the cultural heritage of everyone, and they undertake their work together. So their approach is based on finding common ground, not by pretending that the harms of the past are not real, but through common recognition of those harms and what that has meant to different people, and through joint cultural healing. And there have even been on either side of all sides of this committee, people who have participated who were themselves directly victims on opposite sides of the conflict back in the 1970s. Their work was very inspiring to me. I remember the two gentlemen who you see here, who were at the time the two co-chairs, one Turkish Cypriot, one Greek Cypriot of the committee, came together to the Human Rights Council to an intersessional meeting on cultural heritage and actually got up and spoke together sort of in an embrace. And that was not just sort of an easy gesture. These are people who had worked together very hard in the cultural field to respect the cultural heritage of everyone, despite a difficult and very painful past involving attacks on cultural heritage. And this to me is an example to which I have returned again and again. And I think we can learn a lot from it in this field. So as we consider the contributions that international cultural relations can make to building peace, time permitting, and I realize my time is beginning to run out, I want to mention three issues in particular. The first is consultation and participation. The second is the human rights of cultural rights defenders. And the third is the issue of reflecting on cultural mixing and mixed cultural identities in our international cultural relations and in our intercultural work. And these are three issues that I spent a great deal of time working on when I was special rapporteur. So beginning with the need for participatory and consultative approaches, we clearly need to transcend narrow and outdated state-centric modes of cultural diplomacy, which sometimes used culture, as I already mentioned, to cover over important divides and rights questions. And here I cite the words of the Romanian diplomat Andrei Tarna, who wrote about this very problem that, quote, for governments to engage in true cultural diplomacy, they must relinquish control of their artists, craftspersons, and cultural emissaries to allow organic expression, even if it does not completely align with public diplomatic goals. True cultural diplomacy requires courage to create a platform for real dialogue between societies. And that last sentence, I think, is particularly important to consider. And indeed, you know, the example that I just gave really reflects that. True cultural diplomacy requires courage to create a platform for real dialogue between societies. And I understand that the field of international cultural relations has really pushed forward this transition that Tarna referenced. But I can say that in the UN system, sometimes the older vision still prevails, with governments thinking that they are somehow the spokespeople for something called the national culture, which is deemed to be monolithic, and that international cultural dialogue merely involves them communicating in simplistic terms with other governments who are in the same position, who are the sole spokespeople for the national culture on their side, which is somehow homogenous. And I think, you know, this vision is very outmoded and is one that we need to transcend in the 21st century. Instead, there needs to be widespread consultation about and participation in international cultural approaches. And I can tell you the Bi-Communal Technical Committee that's still on the screen here really understood that in their working methods. There needs to be consultation and participation that involves reaching out to and involving a wide diversity of cultural practitioners and respecting their freedom of artistic expression and other human rights, as well as recognizing the internal diversities of all cultures and doing so without discrimination. And I think greater recognition and support also has to be given to the many non-governmental efforts in this area, so as to aim to bring people affected by conflict and division together through culture. And so sometimes there are big splashy initiatives at the international level that governments want to be seen to be leading, and a great deal of resources may be put into those processes, while much less attention is paid to or resources are given to local grassroots initiatives that I think can make a really significant difference. And here I remember another approach that really stayed with me that I encountered when I was special rapporteur. And this was in the divided city of Mitrovica in Kosovo, where civil society activists organized jointly activities for Kosovars of Albanian, Serb, and Roma background. So bringing them all together to jointly visit each other's cultural sites. So very much in the same spirit as the Bi-Communal Technical Committee for Cultural Heritage in Cyprus. And in the Kosovo context, this was in an intensely polarized environment where the culture of all had been gravely attacked in both the more distant conflict past, but also in the more recent post-conflict situation. So this was an incredibly significant and symbolic effort, though very small, by these civil society advocates to bring different people in their divided city together to visit everyone's cultural sites jointly and to come to an understanding of the importance of those sites. But the sad coda to this is that I was also informed that these important efforts had to be suspended due to a lack of funding. And again, I think this makes the point about how little effort is sometimes made to support relevant grassroots initiatives that can play a critical role in both intercultural and international cultural relations. And I think that is something that really needs to change. This brings me to the next aspect that I wish to highlight with regard to international cultural relations. And this is the importance of really stressing and focusing on the relevant work of cultural rights defenders, because this work is only possible with the participation of cultural rights defenders. We see that artists and cultural workers can and have, in many contexts, played a leading role in responding to conflict and to human rights abuses, and indeed to engaging for peace. And when they do this, and they may give voice to the concerns of many others, they act as what I call cultural rights defenders. So human rights defenders who defend cultural rights in accordance with international standards. And this category of cultural rights defenders was the subject of my 2020 report to the Human Rights Council. When this category, these constituencies act as cultural rights defenders, they often also face various kinds of risks, everything from professional and career risks all the way up, of course, to risks of human rights abuse. And then their own human rights may need defense. So they may go from defending cultural rights to their own rights being under attack. So I would argue this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are, that one goal of international cultural relations should also be to concert efforts to protect the human rights of these cultural rights defenders that we need so much to ensure the cultural rights of all, and specifically to do so, including those who are doing work promoting peace, which can be a very dangerous thing to work on. Now, if you take a look at my 2020 report to the Human Rights Council, you will see that I make a number of recommendations in this regard, and I stress a range of human rights that cultural rights defenders have that need to be recognized, including their rights to meet and assemble peacefully, including their right to do their work as human rights defenders, and including their right to solicit, receive, and utilize resources, including funding from abroad, for the purpose of protecting human rights. And I argued then and continue to make this argument in this context that governments and intergovernmental bodies must provide robust support for human rights, for cultural actions that promote peace to thrive. And this involves defending the work of cultural rights defenders. This also entails accepting that some artistic and cultural works will inevitably be critical of government and of society, and sometimes of aspects of cultural and religious practice, and requires that governments refrain from trying to control or censor these works or sort of exclude them or disappear them in the context of international cultural relations initiatives. And just to give one example of the important work that I've seen cultural rights defenders doing in the promotion of peace, you see the image here on screen, which is an example of the work of Afghanistan's art lords. And the Art Lords is a collective headed by he calls himself an artivist, Omaid Sharifi, and his organization painted murals against war and for human rights on the blast walls of Kabul. And those walls, of course, were needed to protect from Taliban attacks in particular. And what they sought to do was to remake these structures as fields of reflection, civic dialogue, and even simply as beautiful spaces, as you see here. Now, sadly, most, if not all, of these murals have now been painted over, and the art lords, excuse me, have been forced into exile since basically their country fell to the Taliban. But what is very inspiring is that the art lords and other displaced Afghan artists continue working with culture to sustain Afghans and to support human rights in Afghanistan. And I've been following in social media the amazing initiatives that they've undertaken, most recently for the 1-year anniversary of the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, and really trying to keep cultural work, Afghan cultural work, alive in the diaspora, and to use it as a space for reflection about the current situation in the country. And I think it is critically important that the international community, including through international cultural initiatives, support sectors such as these, given the terrible pressures that they sometimes face. So the entire, I worked on the evacuations from Afghanistan. Basically, the entire collective of the art lords had to be evacuated from the country. Or here you see, of course, one representative of those very brave artists in Russia who have been making art against the current war. And you see the example here of the 76-year-old Russian artist, Elena Osipova, who has been painting against the invasion of Ukraine and has actually been arrested carrying her paintings in public, with the works sometimes being confiscated from her. And so I think, we really face the question of how we can do more at the international level to sustain and support cultural rights defenders like these. And this is something we have sought to do in the cultural rights field, but I think much more is needed, and creative and courageous approaches to international cultural relations could really assist us in finding, I think, better solutions and better strategies for supporting these sectors. And I'm actually going to take the PowerPoint down now, and for the rest of my remarks, just speak directly to you, because this brings me to the third specific area I wish to raise. And this has to do with the importance of a cultural rights-based approach to international cultural relations needing to reflect the diversities of all cultures. And this goes back to something I said about sort of cultural dialogue in the UN system. International cultural relations are not simple dialogues that sort of reflect monolithic wholes speaking as one to each other bilaterally. To paraphrase the words of the Haitian poet Jacques-Stéphane Alexis, we are all the children of what he called an infinity of cultures. And my final report to the UN General Assembly as Special Rapporteur in 2021 was about cultural mixing, cultural syncretism, and mixed cultural identities. And I think in recent years, we've seen that increasingly monolithic notions of culture and identity and very purist views of the interrelationships of diverse cultures have taken hold in various sectors across the political spectrum around the world and have been advocated by some governments. And it's interesting to see some of the new sort of far-right governments that we're seeing kind of share this view in a very monolithic culture. For example, Steve Bannon, former advisor to former President Trump in in the United States, talked about the US having one culture, which of course is completely ridiculous and leads you to wonder, has he ever been to the country that he's claiming to represent in this way? But we've seen this discourse reflected again and again. And I think one thing we have to be careful of, as important as international cultural relations initiatives are, is we have to be careful of thin versions of what these relations mean that can reflect and project these views of sort of monolithic cultures engaged in bilateral dialogue with each other. I think we need to make sure that there is greater recognition of what I call human rights respecting cultural mixing and syncretism within all cultures, and increased respect and recognition of mixed and multiple cultural identities within every society that is reflected in these international cultural relations initiatives. And I stress that I also recognize that cultures do not always mix from a position of equality, and there's some very complicated issues that arise here that I addressed in my report. Nevertheless, I think these realities of the sort of diversity of cultural diversities need to be recognized in international cultural relations initiatives, which should be a chorus of many different voices on all sides, rather than a simple interaction between monolithic voices, which disappears all the other voices. So let me conclude by saying we have many struggles to wage in the 21st century. At getting up and watching the news first thing this morning, we're reminded of many of these, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, with the rise of the far right in many countries. We've seen this again this morning. But I believe that one of the most important struggles that we face is actually the struggle to hold on to hope and our belief in the ability to change things for the better and to find solutions to what seem like intractable conflicts. And I think cultures can really help to give us back that sense of hope and that sense of the ability to find solutions if we act together creatively. And so I really wanted to end on a note of optimism. I truly believe that international cultural relations initiatives, if infused with the energy, commitment, and sense of obligations of cultural rights, if determined to center and protect and promote the work of cultural rights defenders, and if they truly strive to bring together many voices on all sides within a framework of equality and non-discrimination, these initiatives can offer excellent opportunities to reimagine our world together in peace in the 21st century. All of this is very difficult, and yet all of this is possible. To do these things, we need what I've called a vigilant optimism appropriate to our times, which recognizes the gravity of the challenges before us, as the Secretary General did last week, but refuses to bow to those challenges or to sort of throw up our hands. And I leave you with something an Afghan woman human rights defender in a very difficult security situation once said to me, and I think this should be our mantra going into Mondia Cult, taking this work forward. She said to me, optimism is key to survival. And I think these international cultural relations initiatives and intercultural approaches can help us today to sustain that optimism that we need so much. So thank you for listening to these very long remarks, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Wow, very good, Professor Bennoune. We deeply appreciate the wonderful presentation you made at this session. For me, it was clear, comprehensive, and very much to the point. I really like also the very last ending of your presentation with a very positive note, which is, I think, the spirit of our work in the cultural field. I think it's fair to say that we are all very impressed with your ability to present these complex issues of culture and human rights, which aren't necessarily obvious for many in our field. It's not an obvious camp to connect, or it was not, now it is. Your time and effort in the presentation is very much appreciated here. Let me go now into listening to our audience. I'm sure there are a series of wonderful questions and comments. I invite people to write directly on the chat so we can pass on the questions. Professor Bennoune can see the questions there and she can select a few. And also towards the end, we can also open the microphone if somebody wants to say something additional or elaborate a small comment for this. But let me tell you something. While I was listening to you, Professor Bennoune, to some extent, it made me remember part of what you said. The British ambassador Harold Nicholson, who in his book Diplomacy from 1917, if I'm not mistaken, wrote that the progress of diplomatic theory, and I'm quoting here, has been from the narrow conception of exclusive tribal rights to the wider conception of inclusive common interests. And I think it sounds quite obvious, but having seen the difficulties in the 20th century with two big wars and a lot of conflicts, international conflicts, and the work of human rights and culture not necessarily being tied together, this idea of trying to reach inclusive common interest in the field of culture is not something that comes naturally. One has to work on that. And let me also say something additional to that. I'm an international relations person from the beginning. And when I see the international system, the history of international system, it is very difficult to find cultural human rights being protected. This is a word that probably comes more naturally from the League of Nations initially, but then from the United Nations and particularly from UNESCO. So I see that now in the last few years, the idea of culture and cultural rights are becoming more powerful and things are becoming more visible. So I don't know why this is the case now. A field that has been mostly led on the side, as you mentioned, and more derived for idealism, now seems to have a stronger voice and seems to come to the fore very strongly. So just to engage in a first question with you, why do you think, Professor Bennoune, this is the case? Why are we seeing, to some extent, a form of visibility on the issue of cultural human rights right now? And I see this from, as I say, the last few years. It's not the 20th century was very limited to that, if you agree with this. What is your opinion on this?
Well, thank you very much for this important question, and thanks to people for their very kind words in the chat. You're a very generous audience, and really looking forward to this discussion. And I just want to mention, I put in the chat the link to the page of the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights mandate, where you can find all of the annual reports that I mentioned, as well as by my predecessor and my successor, and they are available in translation in all of the UN languages. But thank you very much, Professor Villanueva, for your very important question. So why now? Why do we have this promising moment for cultural rights, perhaps at the international level? I think there are a number of factors that come together, but I would also be really interested to hear your analysis and that of the other participants in the meeting in view of their great expertise. On the one hand, I think a lot of it had to do with a range of civil society initiatives all around the world beginning to focus on these rights. So for example, protecting artistic freedom, there was a huge constituency, a huge number of very important organizations like Free Muse, like the Artists at Risk Connection, like many others that one could recognize that really flourished in the late 20th century into the early 21st century. People working on different aspects of cultural rights, a big constituency working on language rights, a big constituency working on the protection of cultural heritage. And in fact, one of the challenges that we still face, and I said this in the Cultural Rights Defenders Report, is getting these different constituencies to work together and to do so at the international level, although I completely recognize not everyone has the resources to do so or perhaps wants to work in that way. But one of the things I called for was the creation of a coalition for cultural rights at the UN. The way that we see there is a coalition on freedom of religion or belief, bringing together many different organizations. They're always there in the UN spaces, working with the special rapporteur, pushing states, lobbying, and so on. But in any case, you had these very important civil society work going on. You then also had some governments that I think had some genuine commitment internationally to cultural rights. And I gave, when I was speaking to Professor Villanueva before we began, I was talking about how impressed I was with some of the things that have been happening in terms of mainstreaming cultural rights in Mexico, including in the Constitution of Mexico City. And I know that human rights challenges remain, but just very impressive, I think, to see these sorts of initiatives. And you saw a number of governments around the world, Mexico, Norway, one could cite a number of others in different regions, really genuinely, I think, in part pushed by civil society, coming to have a real interest in cultural rights. At the same time, I think there was in the late 20th century, I think, a real growing interest in identities. I think some of that was very positive because it allowed for various kinds of cultural expressions, defense of minority cultures, cultures of indigenous peoples, and so on. I think some also worried that maybe our focus on identities perhaps also went too far and could lead into certain kinds of sectarianism that actually, rather than being beneficial for human rights, kind of undermined certain ideas about human rights. And there was also an effort in the UN, I think, to some degree, to use culture as an end run around human rights. So I think there were certain governments that maybe didn't necessarily have as genuine a commitment to cultural rights, who thought they could use culture in the UN actually as a language to override human rights. And we still hear it, to say that somehow our culture justifies whatever violation of human rights is being, being criticized at a given time. Our culture justifies discrimination. This was a very different vision of what culture meant than the cultural rights advocates had. And so it was this kind of strange combining of factors, and ambiguous combining of factors, that I think really pushed this discussion to the fore. And so I think in that sense, and I really felt this when I was special rapporteur, when one is advocating for cultural rights in this context, one has an obligation to be very careful and thoughtful and recognize the tremendous importance of these rights and push for them and push for accountability for violations in this area. But at the same time, to think defensively and push back against attempts to misuse culture against human rights. And this is why it was so important to me to talk about this integrated vision of cultural rights being within an equally important part of the universal human rights framework, which require attention and deserve implementation, but don't override other human rights. So I'd be, sorry, that's a long answer. I'd be really interested to know the analyses of others, but that's my sense of it. That's the kind of ambiguous moment of opportunity that we had, and we need to continue to capitalize on it, while I think being very thoughtful and careful about how we do that.
Thank you for the answer. And we have now a number of questions, comments. I want to take one that follows up a little bit with what you just answered and this line of thought. Mafalda Damaso, one of the members of ICRRA, She mentioned, she congratulates you, of course, but and also she mentions that you touched on this throughout your talk. But could you talk a bit more about the untaped or not fully acknowledged spaces, opportunities, or incentives that exist in the UN and the international law and or in other international fora to challenge monolithic state-centric approaches to culture? So it goes in line a little bit with what you were saying. Would you like to add a little bit more? What would be the untaped or not fully acknowledged spaces, opportunities, or incentives that you see?
So this is a great question. Thank you very much. And I'd actually love to hear Mafalda's own views on this as well, either in the chat or later on in the discussion. I will mention a number of these, but I think it's also a longer discussion than I can get to in the time that we have. One of the critical aspects, I think, is accountability. And one thing that I said is in my 10th anniversary of the mandate report, until we have accountability for violations of cultural rights and recognition that these rights, just like others, we need full investigation of violations, we need perpetrators brought to justice and so on, it will be very difficult to get the full recognition of the equality of these cultural rights. And so I pushed, for example, to increase the output of the cultural rights mandate, the number of cases that we were raising with governments, and that went way up. And we did an analysis in terms of the responses of states and the other actors that we were writing to about allegations of violations of cultural rights. And we saw there's a long way to go still in terms of having this communications procedure really make a change on the ground. But I think trying to use the diversity of accountability mechanisms available, whether it is the communications procedure of the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, and she can raise with governments and other kinds of actors, sometimes businesses and others, violations of cultural rights, and try to get governments to investigate and explain their action and take remedial action. That's one possibility. There's also a communications procedure through UNESCO, which I think is very rarely used. I know Sarah Wyatt and some others have been very involved in looking at that and thinking about how it could be enhanced. I think that's critically important. I mean, I think another piece has to do with funding and what kinds of voices are being funded, what kinds of cultural voices are sort of being enabled to be heard in the UN system. So for example, there are all sorts of cultural performances that go on in the UN building. How representative is that of the diversities of the cultures involved, of these sending states? I think there needs to be encouragement of making sure that it is really a diversity of artistic voices that are being represented in the UN in that regard. And I would say that I think another space that can really be used is, just like this is a side event for Mondiacult, side events around the UN Human Rights Council related to cultural rights, and especially now with digital possibilities, although we know those are undercut by the digital divide and we have to think very carefully about accessibility there. But there can be a wide range of side events organized by cultural rights defenders and cultural actors around the Human Rights Council, around the presentation of the report of the now Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, that can really raise many issues and this diversity of voices that are not otherwise being heard. And I really encourage people to try to engage in that way and to think about this possibility of a coalition for cultural rights in the UN, which could really break open, I think, many of these spaces and take forward the work on cultural rights.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I'm trying here to sort out the different questions. Also, Professor Abril Joffe asks basically how to codify some of the insights and elaborations that you have made onto these important legal instruments, in particular Article 27 and Article 15, respectively. What would you say to this? How to codify some of these insights that you have presented?
So thank you very much for this question. And here, I think I'm really going to answer as a professor of international law. But one of the things that I've really advocated is that more cases be brought to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So that is the UN body that oversees the implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So that contains this important Article 15, guaranteeing the right to participate in cultural life for everyone without discrimination, guaranteeing artistic and scientific freedom with language about international cooperation and so on. And so that is the mechanism that really pushes states to further implement their obligations in this area. And there is an optional protocol to that covenant, which allows for cases to be brought to that committee. There have been very few cases brought on Article 15. And so if you are working in a context where you are concerned about particular violations of Article 15 of cultural rights, by a government that is a party to both the covenant and the optional protocol, you have a great opportunity to work with other cultural rights defenders to bring that case to that committee so that we can really build a jurisprudence of cultural rights. And even, the committee, literally the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, when they review reports from states to see how they are doing with implementing human rights, they begin with Article 1 and they work their way through. So Article 15, which is the last substantive article of the covenant, so cultural rights at the end, as usual, they get to that on the last day, usually, of every session when they review a state party report. And so we need to do everything that we can do to push that committee to really focus on those rights. So cases under the optional protocol where the relevant state is a party, but also submitting shadow reports when state parties are reviewed by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so that they are thinking about asking these states about their compliance with, for example, the right to take part in cultural life. And again, this is, I think, some of the work that a civil society coalition for cultural rights at the UN could begin to do. And I want to stress that I recognize not everyone wants to work in this way, and that's fine. But I think if there were a core constituency from all the different regions working together to push at the UN, that's where we begin to see the kind of progress that I think Avril is asking about here.
Thank you again. Now going into a more political side, Professor Okaka Opio Dukotum asked a question saying, given the survival for the fittest approach to international cultural relations or the power relations, or what you rightly referred as soft power, in your complex tour of duties as a cultural rights ambassador, is there any hope that culture powerhouses are ready or even willing to level the field?
That's, I think, a very eloquent question that to some degree really speaks for itself. But I will hazard a few comments. So I think, this is where in the UN, we really need to push states to getting away from selective interest in culture and violation of cultural rights. And this was something I pushed states on a lot. And this came up in particular around the discussion of the destruction of cultural heritage. So when I presented my report to the General Assembly on the destruction of cultural heritage, there was one of the most active debates that we ever had in my 6 years. But unfortunately, this was mostly because states were very selectively raising their own grievances about what others had done to their cultural heritage as they understood it. And some of these grievances were very accurate. I mean, there was a factual basis to them, but they were completely overlooking in a number of instances their own role in the destruction of the heritage of others, whether it was indigenous peoples at home or whether it was, across a border. And I really pushed states to try to reflect a universal concern for cultural rights and cultural heritage that transcended instrumentalization. And of course, it's very difficult to achieve that if we still continue to have this kind of power-infused sense of culture and a sort of non-universalist approach to this question. But where I have been pleased is to see some different states coming together in coalitions. So there is now a sort of coalition of governments in the UN Human Rights Council who are interested in cultural heritage. Some of these governments have been opponents in the past and have been actually trying to find some common ground on the thematic issue. So I do believe that there is some hope in this area, and I've just addressed one very small aspect of your question, but I think the hope for movement really requires much greater cultural rights education and cultural rights awareness, so that there are public constituencies really putting pressure on governments to open up and move in this direction. But would be very interested to hear also the professor's own view of the answer to their question.
Thank you again, Professor Bennoune. One of our colleagues, Professor Carla Figueira from Brazil, also poses a very, very interesting question in relation to economics. And I think it has, initially, it's more of an economics question, or I will give it to you, but it has also a sense of the difference in participation of countries. Let me tell you what she asks. With the predominant paradigms worldwide leaning towards focus on the cultural and creative industries, do you see a space for investment in fostering participation and not just consumption of culture? How do you see this benefiting or hindering support for cultural rights? And this is really a complex question in relation to how countries participate in the area of creative industries today. And that has to do with the inequalities in the field of culture that pass through the economic and the investment in between countries. I don't know if I was clear. I'm probably making justice to the question, but in any ways, how do you see this benefiting, hindering support for cultural rights?
So thank you very much for this question. This is something I actually had to try to think about a lot when I was the special rapporteur, and I'm sure that the current special rapporteur, with her great expertise in the subject, also will have, I think, some very important answers. So one way that we tried to address this issue, and this goes back to the work of Farida Shahid before me, was to really talk about the cultural rights of everyone, not just the cultural rights, for example, of cultural practitioners themselves. So when we talked about artistic freedom, we were also talking about sort of the rights of audiences and those who engage with culture, and certainly also the rights of artists and cultural practitioners. But we were really trying to think in a very broad participatory sense about what these rights mean and what precisely needs to be protected in this area. And I would say this whole question of culture as commodity was a very, very tricky one. And because some people would say to me, for example, in the cultural heritage area, we actually need to be able to say to our government, it's important that you protect this cultural heritage because it has great value in and of itself, but also because in the context of development, there are whole communities who are earning their livings from tourism related to this heritage. And so there was a kind of a need to balance kind of the culture as commodity approach, which I understand for certain people in certain contexts, making the case was practically very important, with really looking at the broader sense of the inherent value of those cultural assets and the inherent value for the whole population. So in terms of benefiting versus hindering, I would say, both of those potentials are there, but a simple reduction of culture to a commodity, and then the public sort of simply become consumers rather than people who are enjoying their rights vis-a-vis the culture and participating in it. That kind of a reductive view is certainly very negative for the advance of cultural rights. But I do think there is a way to have a balanced conversation about this, respecting the cultural and creative industries as indeed industries, and looking at things like the economic rights of artists and cultural practitioners. And I did this in my COVID-19 report as a very serious part of this discussion. I think there is a way to have a kind of holistic and balanced view. And that's just the beginning of a small answer to a very big question.
Absolutely. Let me add a little my little coin into that. And as we know, the concept of consumption production has been now referred to in the cultural studies as from prosumption, prosumers, producers and consumers at the same time, particularly complex in the way where culture is becoming extremely technified and made digital. So sometimes the artists or people working in any field of culture, they feel that they produce, but at the same time they consume, and it's a cycle that is not the same as we witnessed many years ago before the digital era. Now the idea of the creative industries is changing very much, not just in this divide, but actually in combination. People are producers, but also consumers. That is something that has been discussed by many. We have time for two more questions, Professor Bennoune. Let me ask you, let me tell you that Anita Wojciechowska mentions two questions, and I'll pose two questions, see if we have time for the two. What about the freedom of expression and religious beliefs and feelings? She says that I think these are sensitive areas, and sometimes we can observe frictions between these both, and it is a conflict that is difficult to resolve, the idea of freedom of expression and religious beliefs. And also she says that another question, cultural rights as a neglected category of human rights. Do you see any chances to strengthen the role of these things? For example, Europe, Council of Europe, still there is no single right related to culture, she mentions. So these are almost the last two questions. What would you answer to Anita Wojciechowska?
Thank you very much for both of these questions, and I'll try to address them briefly in view of the time. So I worked very closely with the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, who during most of my tenure was Ahmed Shahid from Maldives, who really shared my concern about doing everything that we could to bring cultural rights and freedom of religion or belief perspectives together and to defend those rights. So on my case, cultural rights, in his case, freedom of religion or belief, but also to work very hard to make sure that these rights were not used against other human rights, including freedom of expression. And that's why I think we did many communications together about a wide range of issues. And one of the last statements that we did together before I finished my time was to mark the anniversary of the killing of the French teacher Samuel Paty, who, as we know, was killed in Paris after trying to have a discussion with his students about freedom of expression and give them the opportunity, if they wanted to view a particular cartoon, which of course raised various religious issues for some. And we came together to really express our concern about the rise of violence in many quarters, sort of seeking to police freedom of expression, including cultural expression in the area of freedom of religion or belief, and to push back on the idea that somehow this is a no-go area where there can be no debate. I think we need debate, and actually cultural and artistic expressions give us more opportunities to have that debate in creative ways. And I'm afraid that while freedom of religion or belief is very important and non-discrimination on the basis of freedom of religion or belief is very important, there isn't a right to not be offended. And this is different than hate speech against people because of their religious belief. But religious ideas, concepts, symbols, those things have to be recognized as being appropriate topics for artistic and cultural expression, and indeed topics where we need that expression. And I think that was the approach that Ahmed Shahid and I really tried to take together when we were both in the mandates at the same time. With regard to sort of how to strengthen the role of cultural rights in various institutions, I think this goes back for me to something I said, which is consistency about mainstreaming a cultural rights perspective and doing this even within UNESCO. And I was seeing that governments come to Geneva and they're suddenly willing to talk about cultural rights, but you get to New York where they're talking about peace and security, and the cultural rights language, the human rights language magically disappears. So one of the things that we really need to be pushing for is consistency in a cultural rights approach, and also consistency in the recognition of the importance of culture. And I very much support those pushing for a specific SDG related to culture. And certainly we can find other very important components of culture in the goals that we have. But I think, again, this goes back to the consistency again, with recognizing the importance of culture across these spaces. And really all of our job is to be the watchdog in these spaces to make sure that that happens. And I see that it is 9:30 my time, so I believe close to the end of the session. So I should just stop and say, first of all, thank you so much to the very expert moderator, and I appreciate very much your remarks in relation to the last question. Thank you so much to the very generous audience for all of these excellent questions and for the very important work that you do promoting cultural rights around the world. And again, my sincere thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and I wish you the best of luck with the rest of this important event.
Professor Karima Bennoune, thank you very much for such a pleasant conversation with you. It was really wonderful. The name of the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance and the British Council, we thank you, and thank you all the people participating today. We couldn't answer all the questions. We'll pass them on to Professor Bennoune and see if there is chance to still get in touch and answer them. Remember that we will have another event later today. Please check the schedule, and we see you later this afternoon and tomorrow with the continuation of these magnificent events. At the moment, this is all for today. Thank you for now. Thank you very much, and see you later. Thank you, Professor Bennoune. Bye-bye.